This is APUSH Unit 4, and we'll be reviewing these time periods today. First, we're going to start off with the market revolution. So one major trend during this time period is that economic specialization is going to continue to drive sectionalism and further divide the nation over issues such as slavery. The industrialized North, slave-dependent South, agricultural West are all going to want different things, and this is going to really create a lot of tension. The most important thing during this time, though, was definitely northern industry. Some key people are going to be Samuel Slater, who develops the modern factory system and jumpstarts the Industrial Revolution in America. Have Eli Whitney's, who creates the interchangeable parts, and this allows for mass production and greater efficiency, while Samuel Morse comes up with the telegraph, and this greatly expands communication. So one big idea you need to know is that increased industrialization is going to greatly change work in the North. There's going to be this shift from subsistence farmers into wage slaves, and this is because manufacturing is now done in factories instead of the home. There's going to be long hours, low wages, dangerous, and even soulless jobs. A great example of this was the Lowell system, which was a women's textile factory that was very, very strict. There's also Commonwealth versus Hunt, which stated that labor unions were constitutional. However, there's not going to be a major labor movement until the 1900s. And it's important to note that this industrialization is going to give the North a big advantage in the Civil War. Now, transportation. The big idea here is that innovations in transportation are going to lead to the rise of a continental economy and continued westward expansion at the steamboat, at turnpikes, and canals. And it's important to note that it's going to be mostly turnpikes and canals that are driving transportation from 1790 to 1830. But 1830 onwards, it's going to be railroads that are going to be the main form of transportation, and most of these are going to be located in the North. Big question was also, should the state or federal government fund these transportation projects? And a lot of the time, presidents such as Monroe and Madison vetoed these infrastructure bills. Before we move on, we need to cover some major demographic trends. There's going to be this massive population boom that's going to be mainly driven by immigration. There's a lot of urbanization. And as such, because of this industrialization, urbanization, and other things, there's going to be changing migration patterns, including westward expansion. They're going to redefine the gender roles. There's going to be increased female involvement in the workplace. Family structure is going to change because women and children start leaving for the factories. But it's important to note that you still have ideas such as the cult of domesticity still in place. And there's going to be growing class distinctions between the rich and the poor. Now we're going to talk about immigration. So there's going to be a massive immigration spike from the 1840s to the 1850s, with most of these immigrants coming from England, Ireland, and Germany, or northwestern Europe. Why would they come here? Well, there's a lot of land, there's jobs and factories. America is the land of opportunity, and oftentimes there are very poor conditions back home, like the Irish potato famine. Now we're going to go over some characteristics of major immigrant groups during this time. You have the Irish, who lived in cities, were poor, and they were Catholic and supported Democrats, and they were very important politically, especially as we see later on with political machines. They're going to face a lot of prejudice, especially from nativists, as well as anti-Catholic sentiments. As for the Germans, they have a mix of religions, and there's a lot more social class variation, but most are going to be middle class. And these Germans are going to go into the Northwest Territory and not the cities. Now, nativism. The big idea is that as America becomes more ethnically diverse, native sentiments will continue to grow. That is, immigrants are going to face a lot of prejudice. Well, why was this? There's a belief that immigrants are going to take jobs. They're going to outvote Native Americans. They're going to ruin Native American culture. And because the majority of America during this time was actually Protestant, you're going to have a lot of anti-Catholic sentiments. We're going to see the rise of political parties like the Know Nothing Party, which advocated for restrictions on immigration. Now, an agricultural revolution also takes place during this time. You have the McCormick Reaper, which gathered crops with much greater efficiency. The steel plow made it easier to break through the soil. Ultimately, this is going to drive a shift from small-scale subsistence farms into large-scale commercial farms. This is going to greatly increase the land demand, which also drives westward expansion and generally increases the debt of farmers. Now we're going to cover the age of reform. So one big factor that sparked this reform is going to be the Second Great Awakening. The big idea here is the religious revival in the Second Great Awakening is going to drive reform efforts. It's important to note that women are going to play a key role in this revival. The majority of new church members are going to be women, and they are going to spearhead reform and bring religion back into the family. So why does all of this occur? Well, there's this concern over lack of religious zeal in America, and there's also a lot of increasing liberalism in religion through ideas such as deism and Unitarianism. So there's going to be a wave of religious revivals and camp meetings. The guy here you need to know is going to be Charles Finney, and he's actually going to be against slavery and alcohol, demonstrating the liberalism in religion. A lot of people are going to be converted, church attendance is going to skyrocket, new sects are formed like the Methodists and Baptists, and here are some of their beliefs. First, we're going to talk about mental health. The big person here to know is Dorothy Dix. She's going to spearhead massive reform in mental health. She's going to travel around the country to document the inhumane treatment of the mentally ill, who were oftentimes thrown in prison, and this ultimately is going to lead to better treatment for these people. Now, public education. So before, school was only for the elite. So why have public schools? Well, we want to instill Republican values, discipline, hard work, etc. And this is also going to Americanize immigrants. The guy you need to know here is Horace Mann. He's going to be the Secretary of Board of Education for Massachusetts. He's going to push for longer school terms, mandatory attendance, expanded curriculums, and obviously more schools. The big trend here is that education reform is going to take place mainly in the North, and this demonstrates sectionalism. And in fact, it was actually illegal for slaves in the South to learn. Another big reform was temperance. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of problems with drinking. The growing factory system needs sober workers. Drinking oftentimes meant that husbands were abusing their family, and some even saw this as an immigration issue because the Germans and the Irish drank a lot, and they didn't want that to spread. As such, the American Temperance Society is going to be created in 1826, and there's going to be religious and secular reasons for joining. This group is going to create propaganda to stop drinking, and eventually they're going to start pushing for legislation to ban drinking entirely. The Maine Law of 1851 was the first of its kind to ban drinking, and the big one is going to be the 18th Amendment in the 1920s. Feminism is going to be a big movement that you must know. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of inequality during this time. Women are going to be treated as inferior. Democratization didn't apply to them. They couldn't own property, and they had to listen to their husbands. There's this huge belief in the code of domesticity, the idea that women should belong in the home, and they couldn't go anywhere else. There's even this idea of the Republican motherhood, that women should raise children to be good citizens. However, this was very limiting. So the feminist movement is going to be inspired by the Second Great Awakening. Feminists demanded equality and were heavily involved in other reform movements like temperance and abolitionism. The most important people you need to know are Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, who are both going to advocate for women's suffrage. One major event that takes place is going to be the Seneca Falls Convention, where Mott and Stanton write this Declaration of Sentiments, in which they demand the right to vote and for equality. And this is going to launch the modern feminism movement. However, it's important to note that in antebellum America, feminism is going to be overshadowed by the abolitionist movement. However, feminism will make a return in the 1900s, as we'll see later. Now, abolitionism. Abolitionism is going to be the primary reform movement in antebellum America. You have the American Colonization Society, where they would free slaves and then transport them back to Africa. It was a very small movement. They only freed about 12,000 slaves, and it was very impractical because these slaves were American at heart and no longer had ties to Africa. You have David Walker, who was an African American who wrote a very powerful pamphlet called The Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, in which he called for a violent uprising of the enslaved. William Lloyd Garrison is another famous abolitionist who founded the American Anti-Slavery Society, which called for the immediate, uncompensated emancipation of all slaves. He also ran The Liberator, which was a prominent abolitionist newspaper. You also have Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth, who were both very powerful orators for abolitionism. And you also might know Truth's Ain't I a Woman speech. Another movement during this time was Transcendentalism, which was the belief that every single person has an inner light that can illuminate the highest truth. This is going to heavily stress self-reliance and freedom. You have Ralph Waldo Emerson, who delivered the American Scholar speech at Harvard, in which he challenged Americans to define their own culture instead of copying Europe. You also have Henry David Thoreau, who wrote On the Duty of Civil Disobedience, in which he didn't want to pay taxes during the Mexican-American War, and later inspires MLK Jr. and Gandhi. There's also going to be utopian communities during this time. The big idea is that many movements are going to move away from conventional society and attempt to create their own utopia. The Mormons, for example, created religious communal societies. There's going to be Brook Farm, which was a communal transcendentalist experiment in Massachusetts, and this was more secular and humanistic. New Harmony, on the other hand, was a socialist community created to address inequalities created by the Industrial Revolution. Now that we've established the big trends during this time, we're going to dive into the history, starting off with Jacksonian America. The first big idea is that the election of 1824 is going to put the idea of an era of good feelings to an end. Andrew Jackson is going to win the popular vote, but no one wins the electoral vote, so the election goes to the House of Representatives. The Speaker of the House, John Quincy Adams, is going to throw his support behind Henry Clay, and Clay is going to become president, and John Quincy Adams is going to be named Secretary of State, which was really great for becoming president. And Jackson and his supporters are going to call this the corrupt bargain, because they thought that Clay bribed Adams with a position in exchange for his support. After the election, the Republicans are going to become split, which ends the era of good feelings. You're going to have the National Republicans led by John Quincy Adams. Also, the Democratic Republicans were more traditional, led by Andrew Jackson. Now, in the election of 1828, Jackson is going to absolutely sweep Adams. Jackson is going to be the first president from the agricultural West, and his inauguration, or the inaugural brawl, is going to be seen as a victory for the common man. And the big reason on why Jackson wins is because universal white male suffrage is going to be established during this time. Jackson does make a few political changes. After 1828, the party convention is going to be used instead, where members would choose their next candidate at party conventions. Jackson is going to absolutely abuse the spoils system, in which he rewards political supporters with office, and this is going to cause widespread corruption and incompetency. Let's go over some domestic policies, starting with the nullification crisis. Congress is going to pass the tariff of 1828, and obviously the North is going to love it, the South hates it. This is going to be known in the South as the Tariff of Abominations. You're going to have the South Carolina Exposition, which pushed nullification theory, the idea that states can nullify federal laws that they deem unconstitutional. It's the same idea used in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions during the Alien and Sedition Acts. Congress is going to pass the Tariff of 1832, which actually lowered the rates. However, South Carolina is still unhappy, and they're going to approve nullification. They're going to say you cannot collect this tax in the state, and they're actually going to threaten succession if any attempts are made to collect this tax. The big idea is that the nullification crisis is going to foreshadow the succession seen before the Civil War. Even though Andrew Jackson doesn't like the tariff, he still wants to preserve the Union. He's going to pass two bills known as the Olive Branch and Sword. The Sword part is going to be the Force Bill of 1833, which stated that force, aka the military, is going to be used to collect the tariff, and the compromise tariff of 1833 gradually lowered the tariff rates. Nullification is ultimately rescinded, and the Union is preserved. However, this was just a sign of things to come. Now we're going to cover Jackson's brutal Native American policies. The big idea is that under Jackson, westward expansion is going to continue at the great expense of Native Americans. Now, recall that well before Jackson, we've already seen a trend of moving west, and Jackson wants expansion to the southwest for agriculture. He's going to pass the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which forcibly removed the 5 civilized tribes from the southeast to land west of the Mississippi. The Second Seminole War breaks out after the Seminole tribe refuses to move, and the U.S. Army ultimately wins after a brutal war. In Worcester versus Georgia, the Supreme Court found that the Cherokee cannot be forced to move by the U.S. government. However, Jackson actually ignores this decision and forces them to move anyways. This is going to start the Trail of Tears in 1838, which forcibly removed 15,000 Cherokee and killed thousands. Another crazy thing that Jackson does is fight a bank war. The big idea is that Jackson is going to destroy the Bank of the United States, ultimately causing economic collapse. He first vetoes the recharter of the Second Bank of the United States, and critics are going to see this as an abuse of executive power. After all, Jackson actually vetoes more than all the previous presidents combined. In 1833, Jackson is going to place all federal funds to pet banks, banks loyal to the Democratic Party. Nicholas Biddle, the bank president, is forced to call in loans, causing widespread economic uncertainty and ultimately collapse. The Specie Circular is issued to stabilize the economy, and this just said that land had to be purchased with gold or silver. However, this doesn't really help. And after Jackson leaves office, you're going to have the Panic of 1837, which leaves the economy in ruin. Again, you have the bank war, the Specie Circular, and over speculation, which all caused this panic. One important thing to note is the growth of new political parties. You're going to have the Democrats, which were like Andrew Jackson. And this party is going to evolve from the Democratic Republicans. They want a small federal government, limited government interference, and they're going to mainly have support from the Southwest and urban factory workers. The new party is the Whigs, and these are more similar to the Federalists or the National Republicans. They're going to support Henry Clay's American system, in which, if you recall, is economic nationalism, the idea that the government should be more involved in the economy, building infrastructure, and things like that. They're also going to support moral reforms like temperance, and most of the support is going to come from New England as well as religious Americans. And here you can see a diagram of the development of various political parties over time. The last thing that you need to know is the annexation of Texas. The big idea here is that Texas's admission to the Union is going to be delayed due to the controversy of slavery. So first, Mexico is going to win independence from Spain, and Americans with their slaves are going to start immigrating to Texas because there's just so much land. However, because there's so many people, the Mexican government is going to outlaw slavery and restrict immigration, and this obviously angers American settlers. Texas is going to declare independence in 1836, and they're going to win. And then Texas is going to request admission into the Union as a slave state, which would be very, very controversial. Ultimately, this issue is going to be delayed. Finally, we're going to be covering Manifest Destiny. In the election of 1844, James K. Polk, a Democrat, is going to win. He wants to lower the tariff, but most importantly, he's going to push for Manifest Destiny. Whenever you hear Manifest Destiny, I want you to think of Polk. Polk wants Oregon, Texas, and California. But it's important to note that Texas is actually going to be annexed by the previous president before Polk takes office. Now, we're going to cover Manifest Destiny. The big idea here is the issue of slavery is going to increasingly complicate Western expansion during the 1840s. Manifest Destiny is this idea that it was America's destiny to conquer and civilize the entire continent. And it's important to keep in mind that Western expansion had been going on for a long time for this time period, with the things like the Louisiana Purchase, Missouri Compromise, and the Indian Removal Act. Other trends include the fact that politicians often just delayed the issue of slavery and the growing sectional differences. All of these problems are going to feed into each other, and the big idea is that the issue of slavery is ultimately going to become inevitable. Now for Oregon. American settlers are going to continue to pour into the Oregon Territory through the Oregon Trail. Recall that the Anglo-American Convention established joint occupation of the Oregon Territory. However, because there's just so many people, eventually they're going to start pushing for just the complete takeover of Oregon. The Oregon Treaty is going to be signed, and the boundary of the US and England is going to be at the 49th parallel, and this is going to happen without a war taking place. Now, the big problem is going to be Mexico. There's going to be disputes over the Rio Grande River, and Mexico still viewed Texas as a part of itself. Zachary Taylor is going to be sent to negotiate, but this doesn't work. And ultimately, US forces are going to be attacked in 1846, and the American War breaks out. The big idea is that the Mexican-American War is going to be highly controversial and demonstrated growing sectionalism. Some believe that the US deliberately provoked Mexico into a war. In the spot resolution, Lincoln demanded to know if attacks actually occurred on US soil. The Wilmot Proviso would ban slavery on any territory acquired from Mexico. The North saw the South's support of the war as a way to expand slavery and circumvent the North, while the South saw the North's opposition to war and slavery as an attack on Southern way of life. So we definitely have growing sectionalism. Ultimately, the big outcome of the war is that the new land from the Mexican-American War forces slavery back into the center of national politics, making it impossible to ignore the issue any longer. Mexico is going to get absolutely swept in the war. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is going to be signed in 1848. Mexico has to cede all of California, New Mexico, and the rest of the Southwest. They are forced to accept the Rio Grande as a border, and this is going to increase the U.S. territory by 33%, but Mexico is going to lose 50% of their land. That is everything for APUSH Unit 4 review. If you found this video valuable, then please consider supporting the channel. It lets me know that people actually find this stuff helpful. Regardless, thank you so much for watching.